We're excited to have you join us for the Come Follow Me 2021 podcast and study of the Doctrine and Covenants, hosted by Rod Meldrum and Jonathan Neville, and presented by Gospel Doctrine Answers. In today's podcast, we will study Doctrine and Covenants 6 through 9. This is the spirit of revelation.
Welcome, everybody, to this is lesson number 5 of our Come Follow Me series on the Doctrine and Covenants. And again, we wanted to emphasize that we're assuming that you've already read the manual and the lesson. You've gone through all that. This is supplemental material, and so we just pick a couple of different subjects and then kind of do a deep dive on those things. And I have with me today, again, we have my friend Jonathan Neville, and he is a awesome church historian. He's studied this his whole life, but some chapters here that I think are pretty spectacular. We don't have time to get into too much of it, but I will wanted to start off with just a couple of things here in section 6 in the Doctrine and Covenants. So if you would like to kind of join with me here, this is section 6 in verse 14. It says, "Verily, verily," and I think talking to Oliver Cowdery here.
Right.
And this is Joseph Smith, and this is from Harmony, Pennsylvania. All of these sections were in Harmony in April of 1829. Okay. It says, "Verily, verily, I say unto thee," that is Oliver, and then verse 15, "Behold, thou knowest that thou hast inquired of me, and I did enlighten thy mind. And now I tell thee these things, that thou mayest know that thou hast been enlightened by the Spirit of truth." Verse 17, he says, "I tell thee these things as a witness unto thee, that the words of the work which thou hast been writing are true." So here's the Lord basically verifying this to Oliver. He says, "Behold, thou art Oliver," this is verse 20, "and I have spoken unto thee because of thy desires. Therefore treasure up these words in thy heart. Be faithful and diligent in keeping the commandments of God, and I will encircle thee in the arms of my love." Mm-hmm. And I just love that. I mean, what an amazing statement to be promised by the Lord that you're going to be circled about by the arms of his love is pretty amazing. Now, Oliver Cowdery plays a real important aspect in all of the early church history, and we talked about last week. We talked about the letters,
8 letters, essays,
essays, basically that Oliver Cowdery wrote, which became kind of the original history of the church.
Right.
There were some things though that I wanted to share with you, and this actually comes from a conference that was done up at BYU in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the discovery of chiasms or chiastic structures in the Book of Mormon. This is Elder Jeffrey R. Holland. And basically, he said this. Okay, so this is Elder Jeffrey R. Holland. He had this to say about the importance of evidence when it comes down to the gospel. So he said, "The presiding officers of the church appreciate and applaud the exceptional work being done by so many to search and to substantiate, to defend and promulgate the history and the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, including especially the Book of Mormon, in a way both scholarly and spiritual. Some of the agencies, departments, institutes, and scholars doing such work are an institutional part of and integral to BYU. Says other groups and like-minded colleagues are not part of the university per se, but may be nearby or spread out around the church. Our heartfelt thanks goes to all of you, wherever you are." Said, "But it should be noted that truly rock-ribbed faith and uncompromised conviction comes with its most complete power when it engages our head as well as our heart." Mm-hmm. And to Oliver Cowdery specifically, and this is in chapter 8 or section 8 of the Doctrine and Covenants here, he says, to Oliver Cowdery specifically, the Lord said, "I will tell you in your mind and in your heart by the Holy Ghost. Behold, this is the spirit of revelation." He said that definition makes it clear that truth born by the Holy Spirit comes with, in effect, 2 manifestations, 2 witnesses, if you will, the force of facts as well as the force of feelings. So what I kind of get from that is that we need to see what the facts are.
Right.
Some people kind of go just by feelings and so forth, and they say, "Well, I prayed about it, and I had a good feeling. That's great."
Right.
Some people want a little more intellectual, hard, concrete, physical something that they can kind of point to and say, "This makes sense." And in the case of what we're talking about here, basically we're giving additional information and facts about what is happening here in the early church history that we're talking about here. Right. So go ahead, and I want you to go ahead and tell us a little bit more about what we're going to be what we're discussing here. I closed this book, and I didn't mean to close it yet. But anyway,
All right, so we'll switch back over then, Mike.
yeah,
So part of the lesson talks about D&C 9, which is an important lesson because this was the section in which Oliver Cowdery was told about the translation. If you remember, he wanted to translate. And the Lord said, okay, we'll let you translate. So he tried it.
Give it a shot.
Give it a shot. And this is what happened in D&C 9, verses 1 and 2. It's up on the screen here. It says, Behold, I say unto you, my son, that because you did not translate according to that which you desired of me, and did commence again to write for my servant Joseph Smith, Jr., even so I would that ye should continue until you have finished this record which I have entrusted unto him. And we'll get back to why that's important. He had to finish this record, meaning the plates, right? And then, behold, other records have I that I will give unto you power you may assist to translate. So there was the original records that they were translating in harmony.
That came out of the stone box
in the
Hill Cumorah, right?
And then there would be other records. And I highlighted that here just so you could see what that is. We're going to talk about that more next week. Mm-hmm. But it's important to see that it's right in section 9 that the Lord said, finish this record, the one they were working on.
This right here?
That one right there.
This record.
They were working on that in harmony right there.
Yep.
And then they had other records the Lord was going to give him power, but they didn't know what those were, right?
So what other records are they referring to? Because
didn't know.
Most people don't know any other records.
I have other records have I that I will give unto you to translate. So it was a mystery to them. But they took it on faith. They said, okay, we'll finish these, and then the Lord will provide additional records. And we'll talk about that, as I said, next week. Mm-hmm. But continuing on in section 9, the Lord explained to Oliver Cowdery why he was not able to translate. And it says, Behold, you have not understood. You have supposed that I would give it unto you, and you took no thought, save it was to ask me. And then he says, But behold, I say unto you that you must study it out in your mind. Then you must ask me if it be right, and if it is right, I will cause your bosom shall burn within you. You shall feel that it is right. So this is what you just talked about with Elder Holland. Yeah. Because there was the mind, they had to study it out in their mind, and then ask, and they would feel it in their heart.
And this is a pattern that was established forever.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly. Yeah.
God doesn't just do a download on you without your knowledge or without your consent or without you having to put some amount of effort into it.
And what's very interesting about this, and we'll talk about it maybe again a little more in subsequent weeks, but when they got up to Fayette, David Whitmer said they worked on the translation upstairs in the Fayette room from sunrise until sunset. And I looked it up, that's like 14 and a half hour days that they were working on the translation. Yeah. And so it was a very laborious work, as
they were totally engaged.
Yeah. So what does it mean to study it out in your mind? What were they studying out in their mind? And this is what has led to the question, really.
I mean, how do you study something that you haven't been given yet if it was just going to be popped into your head by a revelation? So
this leads to the problem that the question between the stone and the hat, which I called Sith, the revenge of the Sith, right? versus the Urim and Thummim, the U&T. So there were these two different ideas, and I'm going to explain why they originated and how we can reconcile them. But here's some of the depictions you may have seen of the translation. The one in the upper left shows Joseph Smith with the breastplate, Urim and Thummim, the big spectacles, looking on the plates.
Yep.
The next one shows Joseph Smith with the plates and Oliver Cowdery writing, but there's no Urim and Thummim. Actually, the only one that shows the Urim and Thummim is in the upper left. Mm-hmm. And then you can see these other depictions. Now,
why do you suppose that was, that they didn't depict that? Just because they thought maybe it was too...
The Urim and Thummim?
Yeah, nobody knows.
Really, it's hard to know what it looked like.
What it looked like, and maybe it's kind of a sacred thing that they didn't want to have.
Well, that could be too. But, artists can paint whatever they want. Yeah. So the key thing to point out here, though, is that the pictures on the bottom of Joseph studying the plates, that's right out of the scriptures. You have some scholars today that say Joseph never used the plates, right?
He just set them in the corner.
Right. But right in the Pearl of Great Price, he says he copied the characters, he studied the characters, he translated the characters before he ever had the scribes translating the whole thing. So this has led to the kind of the controversy between the Sith, stone in the hat, versus the Urim and Thummim. So I thought we would do a little demonstration here. If that's okay. I have here a replica of the, you can see that, a replica of the seer stone. That's an actual size replica, color and everything. So this is the one that the church should put in the Ensign. It's published in the Ensign and in the Joseph Smith papers. That's the seer stone that he gave to Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery kept it. When he died, his wife gave it to Phineas Young, who ended up giving it to Brigham Young. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to let you see what that looks like. Then, according to some of the witnesses of the translation, Joseph would put this in a hat. He'd put his face in the hat, and he would read words off. You can hear what that sounds like. It sounds a little muffled. And maybe that's why some of the original manuscript has misspelling and stuff.
Like, what?
What'd you say? What? Okay. So I do that kind of humorously, really, because it's not what the scriptures describe, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But still, that's the theory that these people have. Right. Now, in my opinion...
But that comes from some historical sources.
Yeah, it does.
You're going to talk about, right?
So let's talk about that on the whiteboard here for a second.
All right.
So in 1834, there was... by then, the church was in Kirtland, Ohio. So not far from Kirtland was a town called Painesville. And up there was a very heated kind of an anti-Mormon sentiment, a publisher up there who was publishing I hate to say anti-Mormon, just they were critical. Yeah. And they published a book called Mormonism. And so again, remember this was right near Kirtland. So in this book, Mormonism Unveiled, they talked about these two theories. They talked about the stone in the hat, and they talked about the Urim and Thummim. And they said there are accounts from people they had talked to of both of these. Mm-hmm. Some said stone in the hat, like I just demonstrated. Others said they translated with the Urim and Thummim. And so this became a source of controversy.
Did they even say that they used both? That he used
No, I didn't
both?
say they used both. They
said
there's two accounts of the translation.
Okay. Yeah.
So what transpired was this was published in, as I recall, in October 1834. In October of 1834, Oliver Cowdery published a response to this. And among other things, he said that, actually it's in the Pearl of Great Price there if you want to pull it up. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't realize that this part of the Pearl of Great Price came in response to this anti-Mormon book called Mormonism mm-hmm. Unveiled. And so it's in the note at the very end, right before if you turn to your scriptures, Pearl of Great Price, right before the Articles of Faith, there's a little footnote at the bottom, right? And mm-hmm. and it's right at the beginning of the footnote.
From the Messenger and Advocate?
Yeah, it starts here. Just read the first part.
Okay.
Go ahead, Oliver Cowdery.
Oliver Cowdery describes these events thus. These were days never to be forgotten, to sit under the sound of a voice dictated by the inspiration of heaven, awakened the most gratitude of this bosom. Day after day I continued, uninterrupted, to write from his mouth, as he translated with the Urim and Thummim, or as the Nephites would have said, interpreters, the history or record called the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so that was because this anti-Mormon book had come out and said there was these two possibilities. So what did Oliver Cowdery say?
He responded and said that personally, this is him,
yeah,
he was with Joseph Smith as he translated from or with the Urim and Thummim.
Yeah, it says right there.
Day after day.
Okay, now a couple of weeks ago, I think we talked about the Joseph Smith history when it talks about the Urim and Thummim when Moroni visited. Remember, Moroni visited and said the record was written and deposited in this area.
From their place, right?
And he also said that together with him, if Joseph was faithful, he could translate them with the Urim and Thummim that was provided for that purpose.
Right. And that there was other plates.
Well, the other plates were later. Okay. But the abridged plates were in the box. Okay, so the point is that all through the narrative, in the scriptures, in the first published history, mm-hmm. the Lord reiterated that Joseph had the Urim and Thummim to translate the plates with. So when this book came out, and it talked about these two alternative theories, the first thing Oliver Cowdery testified to, which with the assistance of Joseph Smith, as we talked about, was that they translated with the Urim and Thummim. not the seer stone.
Right.
So as a result of this, these two theories kind of continued on for some period of time. Church leaders, including especially Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, taught this. And if you remember, in the Wentworth letter, they talked about other places, but a real fascinating aspect of this that people seem to have forgotten was that after they were finished with the Book of Mormon and the start of the publication, Joseph Smith took that seer stone that he had, and he gave it to Oliver Cowdery, and Oliver Cowdery kept it. This was in 1830, roughly, or late 1829 anyway. So Oliver Cowdery kept that seer stone. When he rejoined the church in Iowa in 1848, he still had it, and he gave his testimony. And I won't take the time to read it; it's in the material somewhere. but it's actually in the manual. I guess we might as well look at it in the manual. So if you turn to your manual,
yep,
and it's on. Do you remember what page I said it was on? It was on like page
I think it's 21.
21.
Yeah.
Page 21 in your manual, Oliver Cowdery said, I wrote with my own pen the entire Book of Mormon, save a few pages, as it fell from the lips of the prophet as he translated it by the gift and power of God, which is what we all hear. That's what you'll see in the Saints book. But then he said, by means of the Urim and Thummim, or, as it is called by the book, holy interpreters. Same thing that you just read from the Pearl of Great Price. He said it here again.
He said the Nephites called it interpreters.
Yeah, the Nephites. Well, here it's the book, so it's the same. I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also beheld the interpreters, he said. Mm-hmm. So he said he beheld the interpreters that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon with. Now, what was in his pocket when he gave this testimony?
The stone.
The seer stone. Did he pull this out and say Joseph translated with this? No.
Wow.
He said exactly the opposite. He said, he didn't even mention this. He said he beheld the interpreters, and that's what Joseph Smith translated. He says, I wrote with my entire pen the entire Book of Mormon. And that's what Joseph Smith translated, was with the Urim and Thummim. So is the first published church history, as well as Oliver Cowdery's final testimony, when he had this in his pocket.
And could have just pulled it out and said, this is the stone he used.
Totally, he could have. But he didn't. He did the exact opposite. He had this stone in his pocket, and he said, Joseph translated with this. Now that is pretty fascinating, a detail that's in here.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, why were all these people talking about stone in the hat?
Who are some of these people? It was the stone in the hat.
It was people who were present in Fayette and Emma.
So Emma was one of them. David Whitmer was another
David Whitmer.
One.
Eventually, Martin Harris did, but that wasn't until he kind of got a little senile. But he did talk about it a little bit later after he came to Utah. He became Martin Harris was drawing crowds by talking about this kind of stuff, and so he kind of fell into it. But so here's the point. When I looked at this, I thought, okay, traditionally the church and the leaders have always taught the Urim and Thummim, right?
Right.
There's always been detractors.
As I grew up,
right,
that was always what I was told, and this is what the church history always said, and so forth. So it was quite a shock to me to find out that, I knew that he had a seer stone.
Yeah.
I think he had a couple of them.
Right.
But whether he used that for the translation was never told to me.
That's right. And yet it was floating around because starting in around late 1860s, David Whitmer and eventually Emma talked about this stone, seer stone in the hat. Before that, it had just been kind of more of a rumor kind of a thing. Some people you could tell from the newspaper accounts, they weren't sure if it was a stone from the Urim and Thummim or if it was a seer stone. Actually, in this book, they called it a peep stone, not a seer stone. Right. But it was the same idea.
Peep stone was a term that was used. It was pretty common usage, actually, back in those days for people to have their own personal peep stone.
Good point.
And they would use that to, kind of divine different things and whatever. Yeah.
So starting, 20, 30 years ago, some church historians, or I should say LDS historians, they weren't necessarily church employees, but some of them were, started leaning towards this instead of this. They started saying, well, we have all these accounts. Maybe Joseph Smith didn't really translate with the Urim and Thummim. Maybe he used a stone in the hat. And then some more recent church historians have started saying, well, maybe when Oliver Cowdery said the Urim and Thummim, he really meant the seer stone. And that's
this seems pretty clear to me, though, what he
I know.
meant.
Well, especially when you think this was in his pocket when he talked about it.
Plus, this was not something that was in the stone box with the original plate, which is what the interpreters were, in fact, specifically mentioned as being in the box, and for that purpose.
That's right. And the Lord gave him the power to translate with the Urim and Thummim, not with the seer stone.
Well, Jonathan, how many times did the Lord, Joseph Smith, or Oliver Cowdery, who are the three most prominent people in the entire process, how many times did they actually talk about using the rock in the hat, or the seer stone?
Lots of times. We don't know how. But they never talked about this. Okay? That's the point.
Well, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So, but here's the thing. So some people have gotten upset that the church historians have brought this up. And the reason they did it, they said, was to inoculate members of the church, because when the internet came out, everybody was going to read all about this stone on the hat stuff from David Whitmer and Emma and so on, and they would think, well, the church had hid this history and covered it up.
Right.
And that's why you have a book like Rough Stone Rolling talks about this and kind of favors this, which Rough Stone Rolling I think is an awesome book, but it does kind of favor this. And so I started looking at this because I wanted to know what happened. And I thought there's got to be an answer.
Yeah, why is there such a discrepancy between what the people who actually were involved with it said and people who were kind of peripherally involved with it and what they said? I mean, because David Whitmer wasn't directly involved. Well, Emma was somewhat involved, though. She actually wrote some of the actual
and David Whitmer was involved.
Original manuscript.
Because David Whitmer said he saw it. So let me just tell you one thing that this has led to, okay? And then I'll explain the solution.
Awesome. Yeah.
Well, talk about the solution. Okay, this is a book we talked about in week 1. Yeah. And it's Royal Skousen's book, The History of the Text of the Book of Mormon, the King James Quotations in the Book of Mormon. And I have to tell you, we have several Royal's books here. He's an awesome scholar. I love all the work that he's done. As far as the research he's done, his conclusions, I think, are wrong in some respects. And this is one of them. Yeah. Because right here at the beginning, he says, based on the linguistic evidence, the translation must have involved serious intervention from the English language translator who was not Joseph Smith. What does that mean? In other words, he's saying Joseph Smith didn't translate it.
Basically, or some other...
Well, he says, nonetheless, the text was revealed to Joseph Smith by means of his translation instrument, and he read it off word for word to his scribe. So if I took this stone, just like if I took this book, here's an example of the Book of Commandments. If I sit here and read the words, it says, behold, I say unto you that you shall let your time be devoted to the studying of the Scriptures. I'm not translating anything, I'm just reading it. That's not a translation. Right. Same thing if I'm reading the words off the stone. Behold, I say unto you, Rod Meldrum, Okay, that's not a translation. And that's what the scholars are saying.
Yeah.
So I wanted to understand, how could so many people say that Joseph Smith used a stone in the hat when Joseph Smith, the Lord, Oliver Cowdery, John Whitmer said he used... They always
talked about the Urim and Thummim.
Yeah. So one way, as I said, was to redefine the words, but that doesn't make sense because right in this book they distinguished between the two. It wasn't the same word. So I went back to the original accounts, and I read...
By the way, folks, this has taken some pretty serious sleuthing.
Yeah, it has.
To figure some of this stuff out, yes.
So I went back to the original accounts, and it turns out David Whitmer described what I consider now to be a demonstration. And he said they set up a big table in the lower part of the farmhouse. Most of the translation took place upstairs. But if you've been to the Fayette house, you know there's a big open space downstairs. Yeah. And now archaeologists are saying there was probably 2 houses next to each other. But anyway, it was an open area. They had people sit around the table. They had 3 scribes set up so that when one got tired writing, the next one could take over. So that means Joseph Smith was translating pretty fast.
Yeah.
For the scribe to get tired so another one could take over, right? It'd be like if you're trying to write down what we're saying right now, you'd have to write pretty fast. And your arm would get tired, you'd have to have someone else take over. That is completely unlike the other accounts of the translation. That's a key point. But he said that Joseph Smith came down.
Yeah, because I can put a lot of words out here, but having served a mission in a foreign language, sometimes it takes time for your brain to process from that language into the English. It might have slowed down the process, but it sounded like at this point in time he was almost just like reading it out of the. I don't know. Does that sound what you're talking about there?
Yeah, sort of. The okay. So, but remember we talked about Oliver Cowdery, and it said you have to study it out in your mind, right?
Right.
So I skipped ahead to a couple slides, so I didn't want to do that. The Lord told Oliver Cowdery you have to study it out in your mind and then ask if it's true and all that. That's not what happened during this demonstration.
Right.
Because he was speaking fast enough that the scribes were getting tired and having to take turns. Normally the translation was laborious. They would work from sunrise to sunset. But during this one event, or possibly more than one, but most likely just one, it may have taken a couple of sessions, but they had family members, Joseph's family members, the Whitmer family members.
2 or 3 different writers?
Yeah, they had 3. The interesting thing is there was a girl working for the Whitmers, and she was curious what was going on. She felt uneasy, and she said, I'm going to quit if you guys don't tell me what's going on. and plus, of course, Joseph's family wanted to know how it was happening, and all the Whitmers. So what it appears
wasn't Joseph Smith also under under orders not to show?
Exactly. That's right. He couldn't show the Urim and Thummim.
Not to show the Urim and Thummim. These people were not
plates,
supposed to see the Urim and Thummim.
Or even
so
the
how's he doing a demonstration of translating if he doesn't even have the Urim and Thummim there?
That's right. So he couldn't do a demonstration. He just had to tell them, and obviously they were unsatisfied with that. So what I think happened, and I've gone through in a lot of detail in the original manuscript, who wrote what. It was the Whitmer brothers and Oliver that wrote the original manuscript, but the printer said Emma's writing was on it, and David said Emma was one of the scribes in Fayette, which everybody thought it was only in Harmony, but he said in Fayette. So she had to be one of the scribes, and it had to be second Nephi. And so she was one of the 3 that were set up at the table. And so what I kind of pieced together by going through all this detail, and it's a lot of detail, is that Joseph decided when he got to 2 Nephi, they were translating Isaiah chapters. And I think he told Oliver, probably told the Lord, he said, look, I'm going to satisfy the curiosity. I'm just going to recite Isaiah from memory for a few chapters to show them the process. Because at that time, this idea of a stone in the hat was common. People knew that. There was a way people would find treasure and all that. But so he went downstairs, took his seer stone, the same one that he had given to Oliver later, put it in the hat, recited Isaiah. But then he wasn't translating anything, so he could do it fast. So the scribes were getting tired. Then, and that's why when you read those chapters in Isaiah, and in the book I say which ones, you can see that there's little memorization errors, like a dropped phrase or inverted phrase or a word that doesn't fit. It has nothing to do with the translation. And it's always been a puzzle for the scholars to explain this. Other parts of Isaiah that he translated, he added significant verses to or significantly changed, and those all make sense as a translation. But for this part, he was just going from memory, and there's a lot more to it.
He had a brilliant mind, and then
he did,
obviously, to be able to remember Isaiah chapters.
Well, the historians say he gave something like 200 sermons with no notes ever, and he was quoting scriptures all the time. I mean, he had like a photographic
memory. Yeah.
Okay,
that
so
makes sense.
The point is that's cool about this. All the people who were present saw this demonstration, right? So they would talk about him translating with the stone in the hat. But the problem was he didn't actually ever translate anything. He was just reciting from memory. All the translation he did with the Urim and Thummim. It was mainly with Oliver Cowdery, but also the Whitmer brothers and Emma. So later on, the question is...
They were the ones primarily that said that he did the translation with the stone in the hat.
Well, it was Emma and David was just an observer. David observed this demonstration, and other people that were there. Kind of rumors went around, newspaper published, and that. So you could see why the demonstration would lead people to think, because that's what they actually saw or they heard someone say, hearsay. So the question is, why did David Whitmer, who hadn't observed the actual translation because he said it was upstairs, and why did Emma talk about this stone in the hat?
Because if Joseph Smith was actually using the plates, and she never saw the plates, and she obviously never witnessed the translation process that they were doing upstairs.
Exactly. And don't forget, a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, we talked about the reason that they went up to Fayette. And in the manual, it said that Oliver Cowdery was concerned about their safety. And in Lucy Mack's history, that isn't what happened at all. In Lucy Mack's history, she said one day Joseph applied the Urim and Thummim to his eyes to look on the plates. This is in Harmony in late May.
Yeah.
And instead of having the words of the translation, he got a commandment to write to David Whitmer. So we know
that specifically said the Urim and Thummim.
Yeah, the Urim and Thummim.
So he was using
applying
that.
to his eyes, looking on the plate. So it's all right there.
What other evidence is there that Joseph was using the Urim and Thummim? I mean, all the way through the whole translation process. Because some people say, well, it started off with the Urim and Thummim, and then he felt it was easier to just use the rock and the hat.
Yeah.
And then he basically did that for the rest of the time. But I know that in your books you talk about a couple of times when they were actually working on the translation, and they started in the morning, got out the interpreters, and then he saw something else.
Well,
I think you're going to talk about this with David, right?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. But we don't want to get too into the weeds because there's plenty of resources y'all can read about this.
Right.
We've written books about it. There's videos. But to specifically on your point, after he lost 116 pages, he gave up the Urim and Thummim and the plates. He said he got them both back. And his mother and father came to visit him in Harmony. And she said that Joseph told her, I got the Urim and Thummim back, and now I can translate again. And she mentioned that the box that she...
The Lord never took away his seer stone, so...
Yeah, right. He had the seer stone the whole time.
So he could have just done it.
Right.
So
Totally.
Yeah, so he didn't really need to have the Urim and Thummim if he had the seer stone, but he couldn't translate without the Urim and Thummim.
Well, plus, remember we just read Oliver Cowdery said that he saw the interpreters, but that he wasn't there when they did the 116 pages, right? So anyway, there's lots of things that come into play here. Yeah. But the point I want to get at is answering this question of why people said this versus this. And these were people who observed the demonstration, including Emma, who was one of the scribes during the demonstration. Mm-hmm. So they said...
she didn't actually be a scribe for him when he was doing the regular translation process.
Well, she was a scribe. She wrote most of the book of Mosiah.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. So,
but that was in Harmony, and I'll get. Now we're getting more into the weeds. I'm just talking about Fayette, why she said this, because she was present during this demonstration. Yeah. And so what happened? And by the way, David Whitmer, Emma, Martin Harris, they never talked about this while Joseph and Oliver were alive. It was only after they died. And what happened is about the same time. In fact, in this same book, there was this. They proposed a theory for explaining the Book of Mormon, which was the Solomon Spaulding theory. And this might get in the weeds, so excuse us if it is, but it's fascinating stuff. Hopefully you care. But it explains this.
Yeah.
So
and this is critical, folks, because basically this is something that has caused a lot of people to really question their faith. Right. Because the early historians and so forth were talking about this being done with the Urim and Thummim, and now we have this new narrative.
Yeah, and this whole stone in the hat thing was used by the critics for decades to get people to not listen to the missionaries or to leave the church.
But why would critics use the stone in the hat thing? What was that some kind of voodoo or something?
Well, it's kind of a magical thinking kind of a thing, and it's not. It's the opposite of what Joseph Smith said. Is the bottom line, because Joseph Smith said, and the scriptures say, translate the engravings on the plates with the Urim and Thummim. If Joseph Smith really just used this, then all the narrative in the scriptures, even the purpose for the place, doesn't make sense. Yeah. And so young people today...
Why would the Lord have all these different prophets and then Mormon Moroni abridge everything and make all the plates and do all this work just so it could be set aside, and Joseph Smith is just going to read it off of a stone in a hat anyway? Why go through all the effort?
Right. And as this book pointed out, if you just read off the stone in the hat, how do you know it's a translation of anything? Yeah, the only way Joseph Smith knew it was a translation is because he was looking on the plates and translating the inscriptions.
And that makes sense then with when somebody was asking Joseph Smith, was there any other language besides the Reformed Egyptian on the plates?
Right.
And he said no.
Yeah.
Well, how would he know that if he hadn't gone through every page,
right,
or I should say every plate, and looked at the characters and translated from them and so forth? He wouldn't know what other language might be there.
That's right. So the point is, the Solomon Spaulding theory came up. And this was the idea that this guy named Solomon Spaulding had written a novel about explaining why the mounds were there and they were ancient Israelites and so on. And so the theory was that Sidney Rigdon had got a hold of the manuscript, added a bunch of Christian sermons, and secretly gave it to Joseph Smith. And then Joseph Smith sat behind a curtain and read the manuscript while his scribes wrote it down. That was the theory of the Solomon Spaulding. And people loved that. The media in the East Coast press in New York and Chicago, not Chicago, but
the mainstream
Philadelphia.
media
Mainstream media of the time, the CNN of the time, wrote about the Solomon Spaulding theory. That answered it. That was the end of it. End of story. By the time
they had the fact checkers,
Yeah, the fact checkers. And so even this testimony we just read from Oliver Cowdery when he rejoined the church, it kind of just as an excerpt in there. But right after that, he reaffirmed, he said Solomon Spaulding did not write it, and Sidney Rigdon did not write it. And he said that because that was such a prevalent theory. By the time David Whitmer and Emma, assuming Emma really said what she did, and we can talk about that too if you want, but David Whitmer recognized in his history and his account that the biggest threat to the Book of Mormon in his day was the Solomon Spaulding theory. That was by far the biggest threat. And he went on and explained that, and he says, and that's why he used this, because he said Joseph Smith had nothing to read from. Emma said the same thing. He had no manuscript to read from. Why do they say that? Because of the Solomon Spaulding theory. And so it was essential for them to say Joseph Smith was out in the open, there was no curtain, there was nothing to hide. We all saw him. He took this stone, put it in a hat, and read off the translation. Therefore, the Solomon Spaulding theory was bogus. And in their minds, that was more important.
Set that apart,
Yeah, that was more important to defeat that Solomon Spaulding thing than to talk about the Urim and Thummim and the plates behind a screen. No one could see them. That made it, that narrative
made it a little more
supported
plausible
the Spaulding thing. Yeah,
that he could have been actually back there with the secret manuscript. Yeah.
So they focused on that, and this, it was kind of an epiphany for me to understand this, and it was only after I started reading all these accounts, these Sith accounts, in context. Because in all the church history books and on the Fair Mormon and all that, they just take these quotes. Even in the Saints book and stuff, they take the quote, but they don't read the whole context. So they don't know why people were saying this, even though they were referring to just a demonstration, not the translation. And what this all comes back to is...
That's real important to understand this.
It's really important because it attacks the credibility of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery.
Well, what is the resource or the documentation about this demonstration? As far as
it was mainly from David Whitmer,
and that kind of tells you who was there.
I'll tell you how this is the book I wrote about it. Because I started off like all these books. I start off by making notes to myself. I said, "Oh, that's interesting. One thing leads to another." I start talking to people, and they ask questions like you just did, and so I have to explain that, and then it ends up as a whole book. And this is only there's like 400 and something footnotes in here to other references. And there's actually a second part of this that's coming out in a couple of weeks that gets into this even more. But this was the book that I wrote to explain the subtitle. Well, it's called The Man That Can Translate, Joseph Smith and the Nephite Interpreters, because I wanted people to have, as Elder Holland said, a reason for belief. What are the evidences that support their belief in what Joseph Smith and Oliver said? It's easy to say, well, we have all these witnesses, so they must have told the truth. Oliver and Joseph weren't telling the truth, and the scriptures are wrong. That's easy to say. And it's also easy for some faithful LDS to say, well, Joseph and Oliver are wrong. All these people were just liars. And as a lawyer, I've been around this enough to know that most people don't just lie. I mean, everybody lies, but that they also say the truth about what they saw. And I think David Whitmer told the truth about what he saw. And if
you have multiple witnesses, then that gives credibility to one or the other of them.
But at the same time, if you say all these people were telling the truth about the translation, then it's a conflict. If they were telling the truth about the demonstration, then there's no conflict. That's what I thought was so awesome. And once I recognized this, and I explained it all in here, once I recognized this, I can take any account from church history and it fits perfectly, and it corroborates what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery always taught. It's awesome. I mean, it's just really, for me, it's one of the most exciting things about studying church history this year is to realize that what critics, anti-Mormons, former LDS, a lot of people have left the church because of this. I've talked to several of them. And it's because there was not a good explanation of how you reconcile this with this. And once you understand this, And you know that Joseph Smith actually translated ancient records with the Urim and Thummim, just like he said. And I explained in here why you can tell it's a translation and not a composition. But once you understand that, then this is not a problem anymore for you. Mm-hmm. It's really
well. There's also just another little factor that you brought out in one of the other books as well, and that is the fact that if Joseph Smith was basically just using this and the hat and just reading it off of there, then he has really no responsibility other than just that he pronunciates the words properly
right.
for the person. So really, it's not his problem if something came up on the stone wrong or had the wrong word. Well, it's interesting that Joseph Smith went back and actually corrected a number of things in the manuscript and so forth, and actually made those changes, which doesn't make any sense. If it wasn't his words, it was somebody else. Why would he make changes to this, whoever is doing the interpreting, to their words? But if he knew it was coming from his own mind, and he actually had to look at the characters and make a translation into English, he said, you know what, I think this actually makes more sense if I said it this way, and then he goes and makes the change, then that actually testifies to the idea that he may have been, instead of reading it off of the stone, it actually makes sense that he was actually doing a translation.
Yeah. And let's go back to the slide again and look at that verse, and we'll finish up with that. In D&C 9, verse 8. Now, with all that background, read this again. It says, "Behold, I say unto you, you must study it out in your mind." That's anyone who's translated something knows. Even if you know the two languages, you have to study it out in your mind in order to know best.
You have to make a choice
of
words and so forth.
Yeah. And then you must ask me if it be right, and if it is right, I will cause that your bosom shall burn within you, so you feel it is right. Now, this is a higher level of knowing it's right than we normally do when we translate. Because anytime I translate something into another language, I look at it and I say, well, this seems about right. I'm just using my own judgment. Joseph Smith had to really make sure spiritually get a confirmation that it was right. But look at this. Does that apply to reading words off a stone and a hat? Not at all.
No.
There's nothing to study in your mind, and there's nothing to ask if it was right, because you only have the
somebody
words.
else was responsible for that translation.
You're just reading words. So it doesn't fit. And so it's really crucial for people understanding the Doctrine and Covenants, too, when they go through this, to realize that several of those early revelations came through the Urim and Thummim as well. And it wasn't just Joseph reading words off a stone in a hat. So anyway, that's enough for this lesson. Next week we'll talk about D&C 10. And if you remember, when we were back here on the first part of this, the Lord told them to finish this record, and then I have other records for you to translate.
Other plates, he says even.
Well, it says other records.
Other records,
Other records have I will give you power to translate. Next week we'll talk about what those other records were.
So this is the records that they had.
Right. The abridged plates. Right.
And what you're saying is that beyond this, there was other records.
Other records.
That the Lord is. Now this isn't just. This is the Lord talking about here. This is a revelation.
Right.
What were those other records? If you want to know the answer to that,
and next week we'll talk about it. Or you can read ahead into D&C 10.
Or you can watch Jonathan's other previous presentations on this.
But we'll talk about next week. Okay.
Listen, everybody. We hope that you're enjoying these conversations. This is getting into some pretty in-depth things, but it also gives a reason for the hope that is in us. I mean, to understand that the Urim and Thummim was not just relegated to the side of the table here in this translation process. That the Lord actually, when He made, or however got the Urim and Thummim basically, and had that transferred from one civilization, the Jaredites, to the Nephites, and then made sure it got into the stone box along with the plates for that purpose.
Right.
Its purpose was fulfilled.
Yeah, that's right.
It actually did fulfill the what had been prepared for.
That's right.
Which was for the translation.
Yep. Okay, so the point is, if you want to have more information, there's resources in the notes and at the end.
So check that all out. Give us a thumbs up if you like our podcast. Hopefully you're enjoying this and getting more out of this. We're trying to go more of a deep dive in things, so that's why we don't go into all the lesson material.
Right.
That you do on your own, and we want you to make sure you do that first.
and the last, because you did kind of allude to the question, the manual has a quotation from Emma from her last testimony, which I have a whole chapter on it in the book to discuss the context of that, what it means, and so on.
Yeah.
So we don't have time to cover it today, but if you're interested, you can read it there. So
Okay. Fantastic.
All right.
All right, folks. We'll see you next week.
Okay.
Take care.
The days ahead are sobering and challenging, and will demand the faith, prayers, and loyalty of every American. May God give us the wisdom to recognize the dangers of complacency, the threat to our freedom, and the strength to meet this danger courageously. As the ancient apostle declared, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Our challenge is to keep America strong and free. Strong socially, strong economically, and above all, strong spiritually, if our way of life is to endure. There is no other way.
With over 700 videos that are inspiring, you can fortify your family and friends by putting on the armor of light at bookofmormonevidencestreaming.com.